Hi, my name is Tora Estep. I am a freelance editor, proofreader, and writer. I've worked in editing for more than 15 years, doing every level of editing, proofreading, preparing ebooks, managing book projects, and even assisted with some of the marketing. In preparing for this talk, I tried to think about what you would need to know about the editorial process from start to finish. I plan to give you a loose framework for how a raw manuscript transforms into a finished book by way of editors, proofreaders, typesetters, indexers, and printers. The process here is fairly typical for many publishers, but you will find that every publisher has its own quirks and ways of doing things, so it's always a good idea to be adaptable. I'm going to tell you about what happens when you get the raw manuscript from the author, acquisitions editor, or developmental editor, how it goes through the editing process, and what happens in the production phase. Then I'm going to wrap up with what I think are the most important roles for the editor. You've already learned, or will learn, about acquisitions in another class, and it's not my area of expertise. So we will jump into the editorial process at the point when the acquisitions editor hands off the manuscript to editorial and production. Handing off the manuscript can happen in a couple of different ways, depending on the role of the acquisitions editor. In some scenarios, that person is also the developmental editor. In others, he or she will hand the editorial team a completely raw manuscript, or even just a concept or a table of contents. In the case where the acquisitions editor is also the developmental editor, the manuscript will go straight into substantive editing, or even just copy editing. While in the case of a raw manuscript, a development editor will have to work very closely with the author to develop the manuscript. In either case, getting the acquisitions editor to present the book project is very helpful. This can take place in a meeting, over the phone, or via an email with the pertinent information. Important information to learn in this meeting includes who is the anticipated audience, knowing the expected audience's level of expertise, needs for the content, familiarity with the subject, and so forth, all have a big effect on how the editor will work with the material. Who is the author? Has he or she published before? Why is he or she writing this book? What is his or her expertise in the subject? Is he or she a non-native English speaker? Does he or she know of any dates when he or she will not be available? Has the author stated any preferences about the cover art or artwork in the book? Also, it can be helpful to find out from the acquisitions editor about any personality quirks, such as a tendency not to respond quickly to emails, or touchiness about particular subjects, or correcting the author's writing. Another thing that's good to know is whether there are any events that tie into the release of the book in some way. For example, will the book have a website? What's the URL? Are there any conferences that the author would like this book to be available for? Are there any products being launched that are associated with the launch of the book? And finally, there's the basic book data, such as ISBNs, competing titles, series, book dimensions, and so on, as well as the schedule. and you will also need to know who holds the copyright to the book. When you get the manuscript, you need to evaluate it for completeness and to get a sense of the quality of the manuscript, because this information will tell you what kind of edit the manuscript will need. But to evaluate the completeness of the manuscript, it's probably a good idea to take a quick look at the parts of the book. I will not go over all the parts of the book in detail, just give you an overview of the main parts of a book. You can learn more about these in the Chicago Manual of Style, which also provides the preferred order of these parts of a book. The front matter is all the stuff at the front of the book that isn't part of the main text. All these pages usually have page numbers in lowercase Roman numerals, so that section 1 or chapter 1 starts on page 1. The copyright page contains all the copyright information, such as the copyright holder and date, ISBN number, Library of Congress cataloging and publishing data, publisher information, permissions for figures if used, and so on. Typically, this page is standard, but it's always a good idea to skim it to make sure the ISBN matches the tip sheet, the copyright holder is correct, and the copyright date is correct. Most books have either a foreword or a preface, rarely both. The foreword is usually written by a prominent person other than the author. The preface is usually written by the author and explains why and how the book came to be. Sometimes the preface includes acknowledgments, but the author may choose to include them on a separate page. If you can't remember the difference between the two, I rarely can. You can always look it up in Chicago. If the book has sections, you will have section title pages, then the first page of the chapter and the chapter text. The back matter includes any appendixes, which is generally valuable material that goes into greater depth. For example, some appendixes include raw data from surveys or case studies, abbreviations if you need them, notes, glossary, references and resources, list of contributors, indexes, and so on. When you receive the manuscript, it will come to you as a group of Word files. Although other word processing programs exist, they are rarely used. Ideally, there is one file for each part of the book. So there will be a front matter file, one file per chapter, one file for each appendix if included, and so forth. Any tables and figures should be separated from their chapters and kept in a separate file. So you might have a file named 05_figures.doc, which would be the figures for chapter 5. You will not get the index file at this point. That comes at the end. When you receive this bundle of files, the first part of evaluating the manuscript is determining whether you have all the pieces. Did you get all the chapters, appendixes if included, front matter pieces, back matter, figures, tables, and so forth? Compare the pieces you have against the table of contents to spot any discrepancies. Note that you can start work on the manuscript even if the manuscript is incomplete, But the sooner you can query the author, acquisitions editor, or managing editor for the missing pieces, the better. In general, always try to bring attention to any larger or systemic problems as soon as possible. The earlier you spot big problems, the more time there is in the schedule to fix them. The second part of evaluating a manuscript is determining if the content provided is sufficient to cover the scope of the book. To do this, read the introduction or the preface to find out what the author wanted to achieve with the book, and then review the table of contents and perhaps the first few paragraphs of each chapter to get a sense of whether the topic is covered adequately and has the right tone for the book. If you aren't very familiar with the topic, do a little research of your own to find out if there are any obvious holes. Also, think about the arc of the book. If it's addressed to an expert audience, it should ramp up to complexity very quickly. If it's addressed to a beginner audience, it should ramp up slowly and take a lot of time explaining basic concepts and building on them. Another element to evaluate is the quality of the manuscript, especially the writing, but also the mechanics, that is, the organization, the use of figures and tables, and so on. The quality of the manuscript often has a big impact on the editing schedule, for obvious reasons, and may also affect who does the copy editing. For example, as a project editor, I might assign a difficult manuscript to a freelance editor who is particularly skilled at working with difficult manuscripts. To evaluate the quality, pick a sample chapter, not the first chapter, and read it. Think about whether you are seeing a lot of grammatical errors, if figures are being called out appropriately, if there are logical transitions from paragraph to paragraph and idea to idea. Does the author use complete sentences? If there are subsections, do they make logical sense? Does the author use a lot of cliches? Is there anything cringe-worthy about the writing? Are the voice and tone appropriate to the topic? For example, casual first person is definitely appropriate for an autobiography, but not so much for a scholarly book about the history of earthquake engineering. Also, does the author make claims without providing sources or data to back them up? Lack of citations can have a negative effect on the perceived credibility of the book. Also, skim the references to see if they are in decent shape. References are often one of the biggest sources of queries and problems. Now, take a break and look at the example of bad writing on the screen. Why is the writing on the slide bad? What kinds of errors can you spot? On this slide, I've highlighted some of the errors that I found in this paragraph. The paragraph also includes logic errors and logical leaps that are difficult to highlight. For example, consider that first sentence. The connection between watching TV all the time and having trouble, and who's having trouble anyway, and what are they having trouble with, isn't made explicit. It just doesn't make sense. Also, claims like this should be backed up by some data or a source. Then there are a host of grammatical and syntax issues, such as improper use of its and its as in it is, misspelling of a lot, grammar, and so on. Now that we've talked about evaluating the manuscript, let's move on to the editorial process. While every publisher has its own process for editing and production, some very detailed, what is consistent across the board is that it is an iterative process in which the manuscript gets cleaner and cleaner, and hundreds of moving parts are finally fitted together in one neat package, a book. On the slide, I have a very simplified diagram of the editorial process. It starts with editing, where the editor edits the manuscript. There are different levels of editing, including developmental editing, substantive editing, and copy editing. I will explain these levels a little more later, but there are no hard lines among them, just a range from heavier to lighter editing. When the editor is done with the first round, which will likely include lots of queries for the author, the edited manuscript will go back to the author for his or her review of the edits and answers to the queries. The editor then cleans up the manuscript for the typesetter. Many publishers have the editor put the manuscript into a template before it goes to typesetting, so that typesetting goes faster and has fewer errors. Other ways of making sure that the right levels of heads are used and the right type of caption is used in typesetting is to code the manuscript, but I suspect this is being done less and less. I mentioned queries. Queries are questions for the authors and can range from something as simple as checking the spelling of a name that appears in one way in one place and in another elsewhere, to big queries that concern the organization and purpose of entire sections or even chapters. As I mentioned earlier, the sooner you bring larger issues to the author's or acquisitions editor's attention, the better. It's usually best to be extremely polite when phrasing queries, especially when they are complicated or potentially insulting. Also, when the editor makes a lot of changes to a sentence or paragraph, changes that may alter the meaning of the sentence, he or she may ask the author if the changes are okay. I also mentioned that I was going to talk a little bit more about different levels of editing. There are a few different ways to classify levels of editing, but generally speaking, you have development editing, substantive editing, and copy editing or line editing. I have included proofreading here on the slide, but I will talk about that a little later when I talk about production. Development editing is big picture content stuff that is usually done as part of the acquisitions process. Here, the editor works with the author to develop the structure of the book, making decisions about topics to cover, how to organize sections and chapters, how to organize points within chapters, and how to illustrate the book if needed. You would also define your audience here to ensure that the book is appropriate for that group. Development editing is usually not within the scope of editorial and production, but I wanted to give you a quick overview of it. Substantive editing, if needed, occurs when the overall structure of the book is pretty well organized, but there is still a lot of work to do to organize the text so that it makes the points that the author wants to make. Sometimes included in substantive editing are systemic changes to tone and voice. For example, if the author wrote the book using first-person singular, but third person would really be more appropriate. In substantive editing, you go paragraph by paragraph, identifying the main point of each paragraph and ensuring that the author has presented a logical chain of ideas that form a coherent narrative. As you know, each paragraph should present one main idea, and the other sentences in the paragraph support that idea. Another important thing to look at in substantive editing is whether the paragraphs are explicitly linked together. Does each paragraph make a logical connection to the next paragraph? Can you, the reader, understand why the author went from this idea to the next? Typically, you don't have to substantively edit a whole book. You mostly get manuscripts that are mostly organized but have sections or chapters that require extra work. However, if you are working with freelance editors, be aware that substantive editing is usually more expensive and takes more time, about 1 double-spaced page per hour. The next level of editing, copy editing, which can also be called line editing. This is a line-by-line edit that is extremely detail-oriented. As the editor, you correct grammar and spelling errors. You improve writing style, for example, by turning passive sentences into active ones, eliminating excess verbiage, suggesting more precise terms, and so forth. You ensure consistency with whatever style guide applies. I will talk about style guides in the next slide. You cross-check references. Do this as you go. You ensure that all figures, tables, and other graphic elements are called out and labeled and sourced appropriately. You ensure that all figures, tables, and other elements have permissions as needed. If not, you need to get in touch with the author who is responsible for getting permissions. And you query the author as needed. What is a style guide? A style guide, along with a dictionary, provide just about everything you need to know to make decisions when you are editing text. For example, it will show you how best to format references, how to use punctuation correctly, how to quote material, how to stay out of legal trouble with copyrighted material, how to create an index, and so on. In other words, a style guide is an invaluable tool for writers, editors, proofreaders, and indexers. Furthermore, a style guide is the way to ensure that the publisher maintains consistency in ways of spelling words and formatting text, thus helping the publisher to maintain credibility. The Chicago Manual of Style is the preeminent style guide for book publishing in the United States. MLA and AMA are used a lot in more scholarly publishing, while AP style is primarily used for magazines and newspapers. If you familiarize yourself with Chicago, you will be in pretty good shape because many in-house style guides start with Chicago and modify certain elements from there. For example, much of the World Bank's style guide is based on Chicago, but one way in which it differs is that it has special provisions for handling country names because of the political nature of the organization's work. There are some skills and knowledge that are important for success as a copy editor, including the ability to write well, or at least be able to recognize good writing. Strunk and White's book, The Elements of Style, is a classic that most writers and editors should read at some point, and it's short. Many more books about writing are out there, but above all, just read. Find good authors and read them and think about what makes them good. Also important is grammar. Learn the difference between their, T-H-E-I-R, their, T-H-E-Y apostrophe-R-E, and their, T-H-E-R-E, and affect and effect. Know when to use a comma and when not to. Know when to use its, I-T-S, and its, an abbreviation for it is. If you are an editor, it's your job to be very picky about these things, and grammatical errors really do create a negative impression. Just about all copy editing takes place in some kind of word processing software, usually Word, so it's important to know how to use it, and especially how to use the track changes feature. Also, use a style sheet. I have an example of a style sheet on the next slide. A style sheet is a piece of paper or a file where you write down any special spellings of words or any decisions you have made about capitalization and so forth. Say, for example, you decide to spell dialogue D-I-A-L-O-G instead of D-I-A-L-O-G-U-E. To maintain the same spelling consistently, write it down in your style sheet. I've also kept track of things like whether to use initial caps in a specific level of head or in figure captions, decisions I've made about hyphenation, the correct spelling of historical figures' names, any abbreviations, and so on. The style sheet will also be passed on to the proofreader to maintain consistency. Also, it's usually a good idea to alphabetize the style sheet, especially if the book is big and has a lot of unusual words. It just makes it easier to find things. Let's move along now to the next phase for the manuscript, which is production. Here, the edited and cleaned up manuscript goes to the typesetter, sometimes called a compositor. When the manuscript has been laid out, you will get first proofs, typically as PDFs, which then go to the author, the proofreader, and the indexer. The author and proofreader review and mark up the PDFs, either in hard copy or in the electronic file. And those corrections are sent to the typesetter, who makes the corrections and sends second proofs back to the editor, who checks to make sure the corrections were made and makes a final review, hopefully. If there are any additional corrections, the typesetter will send third proofs for a final check by the editor. Then the typesetter will prepare the files for the printer. Typically, that's as many rounds as you get and want to get. However, it's not unheard of to go many more rounds. I've worked on a project with up to 6 rounds of proofreading corrections, but I've heard of 8. The problem with doing many rounds is that it gets very expensive, and for every book, you really want to control costs as much as you can. Another reason for catching problems as early as possible. Also, The more corrections you make in first proofs, the more likely the typeset page will shift, which will affect the index. You can update an index, but it is difficult. Let's talk about proofreading. Proofreading takes place after the edited and cleaned manuscript has been typeset. Because it can cost a lot to change typeset text, and because indexing takes place at the same time as proofreading, it's important to realize that the proofreader shouldn't make any changes other than to correct errors such as typos and typographical errors, such as missing running heads or incorrect fonts. Until somewhat recently, all proofreading took place on a hard copy of the printed pages. But I am seeing more and more use of PDFs, which allow you to mark up the pages electronically. The image in the slide shows you what that could look like. In proofreading, you check the typographical elements of the page. Are the running heads and feet there, in the right font, and correct? Are there any stacks of lines ending in hyphens? No more than 5 lines in a row should end in a hyphen, according to Chicago. Are the fonts correct? Are the figures and tables placed correctly? Are they correctly labeled? You also check that all figures and tables are called out in the right place in text, and that all references match their callouts in text. You look for typos and grammatical errors that the editor may have missed, because you always miss something, especially when you get too close to it. Finally, you check the page proofs against what is called the dead copy, which is the final edited manuscript that went to the typesetter, to make sure that no text accidentally fell out in typesetting. When the proofreader marks up the manuscript, he or she uses a special set of proofreading marks that are pretty much standard. These are the ones from the Chicago Manual of Style, and some of the basic ones, such as stet, comma, and delete, are pretty useful for anyone in publishing, including authors, to know. And just for fun, here are some alternative proofreading marks. As I noted earlier, indexing starts at the point that the manuscript has been typeset. An index is an alphabetical list of topics and names with the page numbers on which they appear that allows the reader to find specific topics in the book. The job of the indexer is to carefully read a book, identify words and phrases that may be important and meaningful to the reader, and all the pages on which those words and names appear to enable the reader to find those topics. Most books have only one index that includes both names and topics, but some publications have several. For example, an art history book might have an index of artists and an index of subjects. Indexes are created based on the first proofs of the typeset manuscript, so that the indexer has plenty of time to make good choices about what to include in the index, and to carefully locate all instances of those words. Software programs exist that can aid in the creation of indexes, but as I have no first-hand experience in creating them, I can't tell you much more about it. I can tell you that the index is one of the reasons it's so important to avoid making major changes to first proofs. If the content of the pages shifts from the first proofs to the second proofs, the location of a specific word identified in the index may no longer be correct. Sometimes a page shift may be minor enough that the editor can make small changes to the index to ensure that it is accurate. But sometimes the whole book has to be re-indexed, which can be very expensive. To learn more about indexing, go to the American Society for Indexing's website. They have a wonderful frequently asked questions section. When, after many months of work, you are done with all the proofreading, corrections, and indexing, it will be time to produce the final product, which is usually a physical book, although now it is sometimes only a digital e-book, but the process to get to this point is typically the same. Producing a physical book means you have to work with a printer. There are two basic types of printers: traditional offset printers and print on demand. Traditional printing is often used for first runs of books because you can achieve economies of scale. Also, traditional printers usually produce better quality books. Print on demand is often used for backlisted books or short-run books because the overall price will be lower, even though the per-book price is often a bit higher. And deliveries very fast, within just a few days or sometimes just hours. With print on demand, you usually set the book up on the system using a PDF, and then you can order as many as you like on an ongoing basis, if you're the publisher. Big booksellers, like Amazon, often have their own POD system to ensure that books are never on back order there. The trade-off with POD is that the quality isn't usually as good, and there are many more limitations on dimensions and formats. For example, I'm pretty sure that you can't get a case-bound book on POD. Many professions have specialized terms and lingo. Book printing and binding is no exception. Here are just a few examples. Books are typically bound in signatures of 8, 16, or 32 pages, which is based on the number of sheets of paper you can get from folding one large piece of paper. Perfect bound is a kind of paperback binding. Perfect bound books usually consist of sigs that are glued to a stiffer outer paper cover. Saddle-stitched books have a stiff outer cover and are stitched together with staples. Saddle stitching is usually used for smaller pamphlets. Case-bound is a form of hardcover binding, in which sigs are sewn or glued together and attached to a hard board cover. Smythe sewn is a particular kind of stitching that allows the book to lay flat when open without breaking the spine. It's a higher quality process that costs a bit more. The end sheets of a case-bound book are the decorative papers that you usually find right inside the cover. Headbands are the little decorative stitches at the top of the spine. These and other aesthetic and qualitative decisions about the book affect the overall feel of the final product and support the tone that the book is trying to set. After you have sent files to the printer will send a proof of the book so that you can check that it looks the way it should look. Sometimes the printer will send blue lines, which are inexpensive contact proofs created from the negatives they have created from the files you sent. When the proofs are done in blue ink, they are called blue lines. They can also be called contact proofs, black prints, brown lines, and silver prints, depending on the ink used. Sometimes, especially with POD, the proof will look exactly like the final book. In either case, you need to scan every page to make sure nothing happened to the fonts and graphics in creating the negative, eyeball the spine and the edges to make sure they are even, skim the pages, checking the running heads to see that the text is placed evenly on the pages. Check the cover to make sure that there are no color or other errors, and generally look to see that everything lines up and looks good. If it doesn't, the printer will usually correct it for free, unless it is an error that is clearly on your end, such as a misspelled name. This is the last opportunity to ensure that the book is printed with the best quality and without errors. You don't want to print 2,000 copies or more and then discover that the cover misspells the author's name and then have to replace all the covers. I'd like to wrap up this discussion with a few comments about what I think are your most important goals as an editor. What you want to accomplish as an editor are to make your author look good and to be an advocate for the reader. For the first, you need to establish a good working relationship with your author. One way to help do that is to write him or her a self-introductory letter in which you explain your method of editing, what you are going to do, but above all, to let him or her know that everything you do is to make the book better and to make the author look better. Also, be scrupulously polite and recognize that the author has expertise and a voice that you should try to retain as much as possible, while at the same time ensuring clarity, grammar, and all the rest. The other thing you need to do is to be an advocate for the reader, which also helps you a lot when you are requesting big changes from the author. The author is typically much more responsive when you phrase a request as something that will help the reader. Because you are the first reader, you will notice if something doesn't make sense, or if it is too difficult, or too easy, or if it would be more helpful if it were phrased another way. Always keep an eye out for things that can make the book better, more valuable to the reader. For example, would a graphic help the reader better understand a difficult concept? Then suggest including one. Or does one topic need to be clarified before another is presented? Then move it and ask the author to provide more information. Let's conclude now with a brief overview of what this presentation has covered. I've talked about the editorial process, from handing off the manuscript from the acquisitions editor to the managing editor, through various stages of editorial and production. You've learned about the importance of evaluating the completeness and quality of a manuscript before starting editorial work, and identifying and drawing attention to problems as early as possible. You've learned a little about different levels of editing, including developmental, substantive, copy editing, and proofreading. You've learned that the editorial and production process is somewhat complex and iterative, in which the manuscript goes back and forth, getting a little better with each pass. You've learned a little about working with printers and authors and the need to learn the lingo. And finally, you've learned some important goals of editing, which are to make your author look good and advocate for your reader. I hope you've enjoyed your presentation, and thank you so much for listening.